I'm here with Jon Favreau, former director of speechwriting for President Barack Obama. Jon, thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here.
So you graduate college in 2003,
Yep.
and you start working for John Kerry in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
Then you start working for Senator Obama at the time. What's it like being so young and having a pretty important job writing speeches?
It was a wonderful, wonderful experience, particularly because of who I worked for. I mean, I had, Barack Obama, maybe the best boss I'll ever have, and I got to learn about writing and how to write really well from one of the greatest writers of our time. So that's something that I'll never forget and will always be very, very grateful for.
So you were with Obama on the campaign trail,
Mm-hmm.
worked very closely with him, and he assumes the office in 2009. You're at the White House all of a sudden.
Yes.
I mean, what's that like?
It was completely bizarre walking into the White House the first time. I had never taken a tour of the White House and everything. So we all walked in on the first day, and it's weird because so many of us who walked in to the White House on that first day knew Obama for a long time because we had been on the campaign, the Senate office. So it was weird seeing him in the White House as president, right? And then, I remember that first day, we were all sort of just walking around, like looking at the furniture and everything. And he grabs a couple of us young people that were on the campaign. He's like, "Come see the Oval Office, let's hang out." And we all were like, all like the communication staff walked around the Oval Office, and we were all sitting there in awe together.
Were you taking
like,
pictures on your phone?
Yeah, I still have the picture that the president took of all of us young folks who'd been on the campaign that first day in the Oval, which was fun.
How did your job change from the campaign trail
Mm-hmm.
and working for Obama when he was a senator to when he becomes president of the United States?
Yeah. Well, I always say when you're writing campaign speeches, there's two main objectives. You're trying to inspire voters and you're trying to persuade voters, right? So every speech, you're trying to do those two things. Once you get to the White House, you're still trying to inspire and persuade, but you're also trying to educate the public about the policy decisions that the president's making. And you're trying to make sure that he comments on a host of issues, almost every issue under the sun that happens. And so, when you write things in the White House, you have to make sure that you don't write something that causes the stock market to crash or causes you to go to war, or So the consequences of what you write when you're governing and you're writing for the president are can be enormous, and so you have to be much more careful.
So the speeches that you were writing at the White House, it's an international audience that you're writing to, really.
Yeah.
Take me back to 2009 when President Barack Obama wins the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
You're on the plane to Oslo. Tell me about that.
It was a brutal experience. The president had not had time to focus on that speech until the night before we flew to Oslo. And he stayed up till 3 or 4 in the morning working on that speech, just writing a lot of it out longhand. Didn't finish it. It was a rough draft, so he gave it to Ben Rhodes and I and said, we need to finish this when we land. And so the president and Ben and I stayed up the entire flight while everyone else slept because it was an overnight flight. And we were basically making edits until the moment that the president walked on stage. That was when we put the last edits in the teleprompter. So it was a close call.
So why wait till the last minute on such an important speech?
It was funny because he first asked for research on that speech maybe a month after they were announced that he won the Peace Prize. So it was probably the longest in advance that we had researched a speech and started working on it. But he had so much going on in those months. He had made a speech at West Point a week earlier about changing policy in Afghanistan, bringing the troops home. And he had a bunch of holiday parties he had to go to in the White House because there's like one a day in December,
Yeah.
And so the president was so focused on everything else that he didn't have time until right before we left to actually work on the speech.
Did he say anything to you on Air Force One about maybe not feeling that he deserved the speech? I know he publicly expressed that, it was kind of early on in his presidency.
Well, the first thing he said to Ben and I when he talked about the speech and what he wanted to say was, I want to address the fact that I received this award, this prize as a commander-in-chief in the middle of 2 wars. And I want to talk about the issues of war and peace and how someone who is president of the United States who knows that sometimes you have to go to war can still accept an award that is about the aspiration for peace. And I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. I think that we can talk about how they relate to each other, and that's what I want the speech to be about. So from the get-go, he knew that's what he wanted to say.
And the president's faced a lot of criticism about drone policy, but he's also had a lot of supporters with his decisions in the Middle East. What was your opinion on all of this when you're having to write a speech, but encompass everything that he's feeling?
I think the president has always been very realistic about the threats we face. I mean, this is someone who, when he stood up and opposed the Iraq War, when it was not popular to oppose the Iraq War and many other Democrats were lining up behind it, still said, I'm not here to oppose all wars, I'm here to oppose dumb wars. I know that you need force sometimes. And so I think and in the campaign in 2007, he said, if there was a chance to take bin Laden out and you had to cross over the border in Pakistan to do so, he would take that shot, which he got very criticized for in the campaign and the primary. But back then, that was he let people know that. So I think he has always, the president believes that sometimes force is necessary and that we can take steps that will minimize casualties, that will more accurately go after the bad guys, but still use diplomacy as a first step. And you're seeing that in Iran right now. You're seeing that in Syria. He combined the threat of force with diplomacy to try to work out that situation. So I think whenever possible, he tries to use diplomacy first, knowing that sometimes force is absolutely necessary.
Did you feel that he jumped the gun on Syria at all?
I think I think Syria was an example of, diplomacy is incredibly messy, and that was every step of that. Every step of that was very public, so everyone got to see all the messiness that happens when you're trying to solve a tough situation like that. So I think it actually ended up in the best possible outcome, but getting there was pretty difficult.
So tell me about the White House Correspondents' Dinner of 2011. You just spoke about Osama bin Laden, and he was killed overnight. And I know you had a joke in the speech.
Yeah, we had no idea. I had no idea that the bin Laden operation was happening. And the day that he ordered the mission, the Saturday of the Correspondents' Dinner, we met with the president one last time to go over the jokes. And I remember waiting outside the Oval, and he was on the phone with the general in Afghanistan. We didn't know why. So we were like, our meeting's late. What's
He's on
he
the
doing?
phone again.
He's on the phone, right? And then he walks out, he brings us in, he said, I love all the jokes. There's one joke where you're talking about, little-known middle names of Republican candidates running for office. And you say, Tim Osama bin Laden Palenti. And I just think we could go with someone else besides bin Laden. I think we could do something funnier. And I'm like, well, what's funnier? He goes, what about saying like Tim Hosni Mubarak Palenti? And I was like, well, that's not funny. And Axelrod and I are sitting there thinking like that's a weird addition, but he was very insistent on this. So we make the change. And right before the speech, the president called me and said, oh, there's one more thing I want to add. I'll probably remember this, but I want you to add it anyway. Can you please add, God bless our troops and keep them safe at the end? And I'm thinking, that's a weird thing to add. Usually we just do that with military and stuff like that. And it was, then I found out the next morning that it was because he had ordered this mission.
So Axelrod didn't know at the time?
Axelrod didn't know either. No, none of the political advisors, communications folks knew. It was a very, very small circle of CIA, SecDef, SecState, and a few other people. So
let's say the Osama bin Laden mission didn't work. Did you ever have to write speeches for things that didn't happen and you ended up not using the speech? Like Nixon did it whenever we landed on the moon in case they didn't come back.
July 31st, 2011 was the day before we hit the debt ceiling the first time. And it did not look at that point like we were going to have a deal and that the Republicans were actually going to put a vote to the floor of the House that raised the debt ceiling. And I had to write a speech that was that would have been the president going before the country in a primetime address the next day, saying what would happen if we defaulted on our debt, and how we'd have to prioritize payments, and what would happen, and how people wouldn't get Social Security checks, and what we'd do. It was an extremely scary speech to write. And I still had that in mind when we went through the crisis crazily again a month ago. Because it was a pretty bleak moment. It's not a very fun speech that I had to write.
So difficult speeches to write. Healthcare.
Yes.
Let's talk about the Affordable Care Act, because in 2009, Obama stated in one of his speeches, in multiple of his speeches, that if you like your healthcare, you can keep your healthcare. Period.
Right.
If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Period. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem to be panning out exactly as he originally thought.
So wrote that line many times. He said that line many times in the campaign. When we got to the White House, we started debating the law, and they started drafting legislation. Because he intended to keep that promise, they wrote into the legislation a grandfather clause that said anyone who bought a plan on the individual market before the Affordable Care Act passes would be able to keep that plan. It would be grandfathered in. What happened was, after the Affordable Care Act passed, if some people bought new plans that were substandard plans, or if the insurance company downgraded their plan and cut their benefits, that would run into another promise that the president made from the very beginning, which was, we are going to offer the American people comprehensive health care that actually covers enough things that when you get sick, you don't go bankrupt. And if we had continued to allow, after the Affordable Care Act passed, people to buy these substandard plans that didn't cover hospitalization, prescription drugs, maternity care, he would have broken that other promise. And so he really did intend to keep that promise, which is why the grandfather clause was in there. But the problem is there was an even more important promise at the heart of the law, which was making sure everyone had access to really good coverage.
When did he realize that he couldn't keep that promise?
I think that, as they started writing the regulations for the law, they knew that some folks would not lose their insurance or lose their coverage. But basically, the insurance companies are sending cancellation notices. The insurance companies very easily could send notices that say, your plan is being upgraded with the following benefits. Most people will pay less or pay the same. Some people will pay more, which he never said that no one would pay more at all. That was not part of the thing. So some people would pay more on the front end in the terms of higher premiums, knowing that on the back end, if they get sick, they would save a lot more money because they would have that coverage.
But did the president have any idea at the time when he's stating this? He had to have some idea that maybe, this is too simple to give to the American people. Did you guys talk about that this might be a little simple and overemphasizing it with period?
I don't know. I think that the president thought, ordered the policy people. I said this enough times. Make sure you include a grandfather clause to let everyone keep their plan up until it passes. And I think that most people thought that would do it, but that the grandfather clause couldn't predict what would happen far off in the future when insurance companies continued to sell substandard plans. So I think that's probably what happened.
Was there ever a speech that you took the blame for? Who takes the blame when there's a negative response from the speech?
Oh, I take my share of responsibility, certainly. It happens all the time.
Obama's had to deal with a lot of tragedies. Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut. How did he react when that happened?
He, it affected him very deeply. And I remember when Aurora happened, the shooting in Aurora, I was with him. We were in Fort Myers, Florida, at a campaign event, and we were backstage, and he was about to go on and give a statement we wrote about the tragedy in Aurora. And he said, Favs, you're not a parent yet, but when you're a parent, it's like walking around with your heart outside your chest. And it's really tough. And I remembered when he said that to me, it affected me so much that when Newtown happened, that's when we gave him that line for the speech, which is actually, what often happens with some of his speeches is he'll say something in passing to one of us, whether it's speechwriters, advisors, and you just think to yourself, that should be a line that he communicates to the American people.
So whenever you're writing these speeches, what kind of time commitment goes into them?
It depends on what the speech is. On a daily basis, the speeches and remarks he gives, we usually have one day to get them done. We start in the morning, and we try to get him in the president's briefing book by 6 or 7 o'clock at night. Big speeches, you get a couple weeks, sometimes you get a couple months. If at the State of the Union, we start in December, early December, maybe even late November. And we, write for basically 2 months. And usually with the State of the Union, we are at the White House 2 weeks before that speech till maybe 2 or 3 in the morning most nights.
What's the White House like that late at night?
Very weird. I remember being in my office for the last State of the Union, and Cody Keenan was there, who's the director of speechwriting now, and our assistant Laura Dean, and the three of us are sitting there at like 3 or 4 in the morning, with pizza boxes everywhere, and there's people vacuuming the White House and doing construction, and they're trying. A couple times we've been locked in, right, because people don't know that we're still there. So it's a weird time to be in the White House.
So the transition from one speechwriter to another, I was reporting at the White House in April. You left in March. I heard Obama give a speech on education then. How was that different than a speech that you wrote? Cody Keenan's writing them now.
So fortunately, it was a very seamless transition. Cody first started as an intern with me in spring of 2007 on the Obama campaign, and then joined full time when he graduated Harvard later that spring, and he's been there ever since. And specifically, the year before I left, thinking that I might leave at some point, I made sure to move Cody into my office with me, so we were extra cozy. And we just sat together every single day, like 7 days a week. And so Cody and I pretty much knew exactly how the other one thought, wrote. Basically he did with me what I had done to Obama. And I made sure before I left that Cody kind of took the lead on more and more speeches, met with Obama himself more. So by the time I actually left, it was very seamless, and Cody had captured Obama's voice just like I had, and so it was great.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, John.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
It's a pleasure.
Great. Thanks.